Maplewood was the kind of town where the shadows of the night felt longer than the streets that embraced them. Its slow and peaceful rhythm made life there seem to pass in slow motion, like a black and white photo that no one ever dared to color. The sound of the wind rustling the trees, the smell of fresh coffee wafting from Baker's Corner, the distant murmur of conversations filling the square. All of this was calm, until that Tuesday. It was just another day until, at the Salem church, where Pastor Ethan, 37, had served for over a decade, the world began to crumble. Ethan, with his neatly groomed beard, serene expression, and the aura of authority he had always cultivated so carefully, stood before a silent congregation. It was common to see him as the pillar of Maplewood, the man everyone turned to, the counselor for troubles, and the bearer of answers. The summer heat hung in the air, but the tension in that small hall was thick, almost palpable. Anna Carter, 14, sat in the front row, her hands trembling slightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. Across from her, Grace Miller, also 14, couldn't hide her anxiety. They seemed to protect each other with their furtive glances, as if they had something to share with the world, but at the same time, feared to do so. It was then that Sarah, Ethan's wife, entered the hall, her expression blank, but her eyes revealing an unease she couldn't hide. Her husband, the man she had entrusted her life to, was about to change everything. Sarah, in her simple dress and slightly disheveled hair, walked toward the altar, watching Ethan from a distance, not understanding what was about to unfold. Deep down, something was breaking. Before she could process anything, the church door opened abruptly and Deputy Miller entered, a man with a stern expression, known for his unshakable demeanor, but at that moment, he seemed burdened by an invisible weight. Something he knew that forced him to act. Grace and Anna stood up upon seeing him, and the tension in the air turned into a storm. The news that quickly spread through the corridors of the small town would leave permanent marks. Two girls, both pregnant, and the names that came from them were like a sharp blade, cutting deep into the soul of Maplewood. They had confessed, in separate confessions, without knowing of each other, that Ethan, the respected pastor, was the father. The town, which once revered him, now looked at him like a shadow, full of fear and shame. Questions filled the air, but no one was ready for the answers. How could someone like Ethan do this? How could he, the man who preached about faith and forgiveness, become involved with two young, vulnerable girls? The summer heat now felt suffocating, and Maplewood, with its flawless facade, began to show irreparable cracks. At Ethan's house, the air was thick. Sarah walked back and forth, trying to piece together the puzzle, but nothing made sense. Every time she looked at her husband, he seemed more distant, a figure she knew, but now seemed strangely empty. His eyes, once full of security and confidence, were now dark, avoiding the light. Grace and Anna could no longer hide. Maplewood, so small, was now becoming a cauldron of stares, whispers, and accusations. Yet, no one really knew what had truly happened. There was something more in the air, something that couldn't be touched but was felt by all. Sarah tried to understand. She tried to see any trace of the person she had loved for so many years. But how could she, when Ethan was sinking deeper into his own lies? No one knew, but the town was about to be transformed in an irreversible way. What had once seemed like a quiet and peaceful town was now a minefield of distrust and pain. And the answers, the answers, were hidden in the deepest shadows, waiting to be revealed. The tension in the town of Maplewood was rising, like a storm about to break. The case of Grace and Anna seemed to be the center of an emotional storm that consumed everyone around them, but no one knew for sure what the outcome would be. The questions began to haunt the minds of the townspeople, and the small Salem church, once a haven of peace, was now the scene of a silent battle where words were like sharp knives. Ethan felt the weight of his congregation's gaze like a mortal burden. He, who had always had the gift of calming, guiding, and leading lost hearts, now seemed incapable of finding words that could redeem the echoes of doubt reverberating through the corridors of that church. What would he say? How could he explain the inexplicable? All he wanted was to turn back time and stop anything like this from happening, but reality offered no room for regret. Meanwhile, at Ethan's house, Sarah was beginning to notice something she had neglected for so long. She knew her husband's insecurities, his flaws, but never imagined he could be capable of something so dark. The image she had of him was unraveling before her eyes, and what remained now was a man she barely recognized. As time passed, the streets of Maplewood, usually calm and empty, began to fill with curious onlookers, murmurs. Some townspeople were divided, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened, while others couldn't contain themselves and began to point fingers, accusing the pastor without remorse. The town was fracturing, and the image of the just and respected man everyone had known was slowly being consumed by speculation and judgment. In the town square, one figure stood out among the others. Deputy Miller, who had until then limited himself to fulfilling his role with the utmost discretion, was now being pressured by the entire town. He knew something was wrong, but, as always, the details were scarce, and the accusations had to be handled with care. The law, contrary to what many thought, wasn't simple. However, what was happening here seemed to demand immediate justice, without delay, without doubt. "We need to act fast," he said softly to his assistant as he watched Ethan leave his house. "This man, he will never be the same, and this town will never be the same." Sarah knew her husband's fate was now in the hands of others, but she couldn't help but wonder if there was still something she could save. She spent her nights awake, reliving the past years of her life with Ethan, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong, but there were no easy answers. What hurt her most was the sense of betrayal, not just by her husband's actions, but by the fact that maybe she had never really known who he was. Grace and Anna were no longer the naive girls they once were. They were now at the center of a storm of accusations and judgments. Their faces, once lit by youth, were pale and tired, marked by pain and shame. The town, which once looked at them with affection, now saw them with a mixture of compassion and disgust. How could someone so respected, like Ethan, have become involved with them? And what did that mean for the girls? For Sarah, the worst part wasn't the accusing stares of the community. It was the silence. The silence at home. The emptiness in Ethan's eyes. As if he were distant from everything, immune to any attempt to confront him. She had dedicated so much of herself to keeping their relationship intact, and now it seemed to be crumbling before her eyes, and she didn't know how to stop it. Maplewood, which once prided itself on its tranquility and righteousness, now found itself in the middle of a nightmare no one could have predicted, and the truth, so long awaited, seemed like a curse that would destroy everything it touched. The town knew there was something much deeper behind all of this, but they were still far from discovering how far Pastor Ethan had gone to hide his darkest secrets. The only certainty was that when the truth finally came to light, it wouldn't be a simple explanation. It would be a weight, a burden that everyone, in one way or another, would have to bear. The summer in Maplewood was turning into a stifling hell. The dirt streets, which once seemed calm, were now filled with a dense energy, as if something invisible was spreading through the houses, the businesses, everything. The coffee from Baker's Corner no longer had the pleasant scent, and the central square, usually a meeting point for old friends, was now just a field of observation where suspicious glances met at every corner. That unbearable heat seemed to reflect the tension inside every house in the town. The whispered conversations about the scandal involving Ethan were like a disease spreading from mouth to mouth. With every new revelation, with every new clue, the mystery deepened further, and the question, which at first seemed simple, began to take on terrifying proportions. How had he gotten involved with such young girls, and why? Sarah spent her days unable to rest, her thoughts always turning to Ethan, to that man she had known for years, but who now seemed so distant, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. Every time she looked at him, all she saw was a man consumed by something she still couldn't understand. She needed answers, but Ethan wasn't willing to give any. Meanwhile, the town continued to divide. Some saw Ethan as the man who had failed, the pastor who had betrayed his own mission. Others, more loyal, insisted he was innocent until proven otherwise. Perhaps a victim of a conspiracy, a mistake, something he couldn't control. But as the weeks passed and the evidence began to pile up, Maplewood's scales tipped more and more against the pastor. It was a hot Friday when Officer Miller, pressured by the growing demands of the community, decided to take action. He knew he needed to act, but he also knew he had to be cautious. The last thing he wanted was a public lynching. So, without making a fuss, he called Grace and Anna in for separate interviews. Both meetings took place in the cold, impersonal room at the station, where the girls were forced to relive the darkest moments of their lives. Grace, with red eyes from crying, finally spoke. She spoke softly, almost whispering, as if she feared someone might overhear, but her words, though gentle, hit like hammer blows in the mind of anyone listening. I didn't want it to be this way. I just didn't know what to do. She paused for a moment, her hands still trembling. The pain was visible on her face, and beside her, Officer Miller watched her with hard but understanding eyes. Anna, on the other hand, had a firmer look. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were tired, as if she had already faced the worst. She knew what was at stake. He told me he loved me, and I believed him. I thought he was different, but the true revelation came with the phrase that slipped from Anna's lips, the one that made the officer close his eyes for a brief moment, as if he wanted to distance himself from this cruel truth. I think he used me. Sarah, upon hearing of the interviews, felt the ground open beneath her feet. Anna and Grace, the girls she had known as innocent, were now at the center of a web. She couldn't understand, but something in her chest told her it wasn't just about the girls. It was something much deeper, something that had been cultivated for years, behind the closed doors of her house and the church. Ethan wasn't who she thought he was, and she was beginning to realize that. However, Sarah couldn't act alone. She needed help. So, as night fell, she decided to seek out Sarah Carter, Anna's mother. They had been friends for many years, but now everything seemed so distant. The words they exchanged, the conversations on the porch of one of the houses, all seemed to have been covered by a cloud of lies and pain. Sarah Carter wasn't home when Sarah, Ethan's wife, arrived. She was in the town square, trying to understand what was happening with her daughter, trying to piece together the puzzle of Anna's life. The two met by chance in the middle of the square. The silence was immense, and when the words finally came, they were heavy, impossible to bear. I don't know who else I can trust, said Sarah Carter, looking at her friend with desperate eyes. I don't know either, Sarah replied, her voice faltering, almost inaudible. But we need to find out the truth before all of this destroys us. And so, the silent pact between the two women was sealed that night. They didn't know what they were about to uncover, but one thing was certain: the man they thought they knew would no longer be the same, and Maplewood would never be the same again. The pressure on Sarah and the other families seemed to intensify with each passing day. Maplewood, which had once been a small, welcoming town, was becoming a battleground where truth, or what was believed to be truth, was something elusive, volatile. The houses, once filled with laughter and conversation, were now immersed in silence, as if everyone was waiting for something. But what, exactly? Ethan, now isolated, spent his days wandering the house like a shadow of himself. He rarely spoke to Sarah, and when he did, his words seemed weightless, as if everything had already been said, as if everything was already lost. He knew the town had judged him. He knew that many of those who had once considered him a friend now looked at him with suspicion, even fear. The weight of the accusations seemed unbearable, but he also felt that there was something irreparable in the situation, something he couldn't change, even if he wanted to. Sarah, in turn, was growing increasingly distant from her own reality. She could no longer distinguish between the husband she loved and the man who was now being accused of a terrible crime. She watched him, trying to find something within him that could justify the accusations, that could offer some explanation. Some fragment of truth that could save what remained of her life. But all she saw was a man empty of answers. At the station, the investigation was intensifying. Officer Miller had received new information, and though it was still too early for definitive conclusions, there was something about the case that didn't seem right. Anna and Grace were clear in their testimonies, but the word of two 14-year-old girls, alone against a respected man like Ethan, was still not enough for a formal accusation. But something bothered him. Something didn't fit. Ethan's behavior, his apathy, the silence around him. Everything seemed to indicate that there was more beneath the surface. The officer decided to dig deeper. He began talking to other members of the community, looking for those who could offer a different perspective on Pastor Ethan. Some witnesses mentioned something curious, a change in his behavior over the past few months. Ethan, who had always been dedicated and full of fervor, seemed more distant, absent, as if he were hiding something. One night, while the officer was talking to an old friend of Ethan's, something unusual happened. The friend, tired of the conversations about the scandal, threw out a phrase that echoed in Miller's mind. Sometimes, the people who surprise us the most are those we least expect. Pastor Ethan, he was always a man who liked to have control, but something changed, something in the way he is. Like he got lost. Those words sounded like a distant echo, like a clue in an incomplete puzzle. The officer didn't yet know what it meant, but something inside him told him he was getting closer to discovering something that could change everything. Meanwhile, Sarah and Sarah Carter, the mothers of the two young girls, were beginning to form an alliance, not out of friendship, but out of an urgent need to uncover the truth. They were desperate. Sarah's love for Ethan kept her from fully accepting the accusations against him, but Sarah Carter's suffering forced her to seek answers. To seek justice for her daughter, who was now marked by pain and shame. On a quiet night, the two mothers met at Sarah Carter's house. The aroma of coffee lingered in the air, but the words between them were heavy, difficult to say. Neither of them wanted to believe the worst, but both knew the clues were right there in front of them. One of them would have to be the first to take the next step, to ask the difficult question. What if what the girls said is true? Sarah asked, breaking the silence that enveloped them. We can't ignore that, Sarah Carter replied, with a firmness Sarah hadn't seen before. We need to know, and we need to know now, but how could they know the truth? How could they find concrete evidence when all they had were the words of two girls in shock? They needed more. They needed something more than a simple confession, something that proved Ethan had truly crossed a line that no one could justify. And then Sarah remembered something he always did, the private meetings he organized with church members. Often, he would talk to those who were facing personal difficulties, offering advice or, it seemed, spiritual comfort. But what else happened at those meetings? What did he say? What did he do to make the girls feel so vulnerable, so trusting in confiding their deepest secrets to him? Sarah didn't know. But her instinct told her she was getting closer to the answer. That night, Sarah stayed up for hours, searching the house for something that could help her understand what was happening. The silence inside the house felt heavier than ever, and she knew time was running out. The weight of the accusations against Ethan was leaving deep marks on everyone. But she still wasn't ready to give up on her family, not without a fight. And as Sarah and Sarah Carter searched for answers, Officer Miller was beginning to piece things together. Something was falling into place, something that could finally reveal the truth behind Ethan's behavior. But the truth was a dangerous place, and no one knew how far it would take them. Sarah spent sleepless nights, wandering the house, looking for answers. She didn't know where to find. There was something about Ethan that frightened her, something she could no longer ignore. He wasn't present like he used to be. The man she shared her life with now seemed to be a shadow of what he once was. And that was slowly devouring her. The town of Maplewood, once the definition of serenity, was now transforming into a place where every step promised confrontation. The sweet smell of food at the lake cafe no longer brought comfort. The square was empty, the benches vacant like a reflection of the desolation that was overtaking the town. What frightened Sarah the most, however, was how quickly everyone seemed to take sides. The divisions began to be clear, and soon the families of Maplewood found themselves facing a huge divide. The entire town was split between those who believed Ethan was innocent and those who saw him as a monster. With a past tainted by unspoken secrets, Sarah Carter, Anna's mother, could no longer sleep. The anguish of having her daughter fall victim to something so big, so unexpected, gnawed at her inside. But Sarah's suffering was not just that of a mother watching her daughter drown in the consequences of a lie or the truth. It was also the suffering of someone who, for years, had looked to the figure of the pastor as a model of virtue and faith, and now found herself caught in the storm of a scandal that was consuming everything around her. The dialogue between the two mothers became essential, although Sarah was still struggling to believe in Ethan. She could no longer ignore the words her friend was saying. She was starting to see the signs, but the fear of losing her own family made her hesitate, as if she were accepting that this might be the last line of defense before total collapse. That warm morning, a new testimony brought a more critical perspective to the situation. Grace, the first to report what had happened to her, seemed more vulnerable with each passing day. She had once studied Ethan's eyes with almost reverent respect, but as the days passed, she became harder, more cynical, as if the pastor's words, which had once seemed like divine wisdom, had now become the echo of a voice that deceived her, that used her for purposes she did not understand. He said the church needed us, that he was there to save us, but in the end, it was he who needed us. He used all of this to feed off our pain, she confessed to Sarah Carter, her voice trembling, but her words full of anger. The girl's gazes began to change. No longer the sparkle of innocence, but the weight of trauma. No longer the innocent smile, but a look that seemed to have seen more than any child should. The silence that hung over them was now broken only by whispers of pain, of outrage, of fear. Something terrible had happened, and no one knew how far it extended. But Detective Miller still couldn't make progress. Although the evidence that appeared in the girl's confessions was clear, he knew he needed something more, a thread of hope, something that would connect him to the truth. The words of Sarah and Sarah Carter were clear, but he couldn't act solely on emotions. He needed proof, something irrefutable that could seal Ethan's fate. Each testimony was a clue, every gesture a possible key to unraveling what was going on. But the truth seemed to slip through his fingers, like water, each time he got closer. It was then that the detective received crucial information. A member of the church, an older man with a stern expression, sought him out, asking to speak. I didn't want to say anything before, but now I can't stay silent anymore, he revealed, with tired eyes, something no one had imagined. I saw something. A few months ago, Ethan was with one of the girls. One of the ones mentioned in the news. They were in the back room, in that area where he used to hear confessions. I saw them through the window. They were too close, in a way that wasn't normal. This wasn't a conversation between pastor and parishioner. There was something more, something that couldn't be explained. Those words marked a turning point in the investigation. Although the man had refused to go into detail, his words were enough for the detective to take bolder actions. The suspicion now focused not only on the girl's accusations, but also on Ethan's private activities within the church. If the accusations were true, This could be the starting point for a broader understanding of his behavior and actions. That night, Sarah felt an even greater emptiness. Grace and Anna's words were pounding in her mind, and what she once saw as pure faith now seemed like a web of manipulation and control. She knew that Ethan had always had the air of a leader, a god, but now that seemed to carry a different weight. Something much darker was unfolding before her eyes. She no longer knew if she could trust Ethan, the man with whom she had shared so many years of her life. The following morning brought a new meeting, now with all those involved in the investigation. Sarah, still enveloped in denial, knew that Ethan's fate was being decided. And, as she looked at his face, her heart froze. Deep down, she knew that the truth that would emerge from that room would be more devastating than anything she could have imagined. We need to find more evidence. We need to understand everything that happened in that room, the detective said firmly. Looking at those around him, the tension was palpable, as if everyone there knew the pieces were coming together, but no one was sure what the outcome would be. Ethan's future, Grace's, Anna's, everyone's, was now at stake, and the truth, though closer, was still a shadow, ready to reveal itself at the most unexpected moment. The sun was low on the horizon when Detective Miller entered the meeting room at the police station, with an expression that indicated something had changed. There was a tension in the air, something tangible, like electricity, building up with every passing minute. Sarah was sitting in the chair closest to the door, her fingers intertwined, nervously chewing on her lips. Beside her, Sarah Carter stared fixedly at the detective, as if awaiting a truth that could tear everything they believed to be real. The detective did not sit immediately. He took a step toward the window, looking out at the silent street outside, as if seeking strength there to face what he was about to say. The room was full of people, witnesses, police officers, and even members of the community who still held hope in Ethan's figure. But nothing was as it seemed. "We found something," Miller finally said, his voice firm but loaded with tension that everyone could feel. He turned to those present, his gaze passing over everyone involved. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew." A collective sigh passed through the room. Sarah felt the weight of the words, as if the truth had finally manifested. But she wasn't ready for what would come next. Detective Miller pulled a folder from under his arm and placed it on the table. Opening it carefully, inside, there were photos, records, and a detailed report that no one had anticipated. At the top of the report, the name of an unexpected witness, James Barton, the man who had been reluctant to speak before, but was now willing to tell what he knew. James Barton brought us essential information. He saw Ethan in a private meeting with Anna a few weeks ago in one of the church rooms. It wasn't a confession, as was customary. It was something more, Miller continued, his words weighing like a sentence. Sarah felt her stomach churn. She wanted to stand up, scream, demand explanations, but her voice was trapped. As if every word that came from the detective's mouth was a blow to everything she believed, Miller flipped through the pages of the report, revealing photos that showed what no one wanted to believe. Images of Ethan and Anna, with their backs to the camera, inside the church room, with the door ajar. Captured from an angle, the detective assured was done with the utmost good faith. There was nothing explicit in the photos, but the closeness between them, what the images conveyed, was undeniable. "There is no doubt," the detective continued, in a grave tone. "Ethan was involved with the girls in a way that crossed all ethical, moral, or spiritual boundaries. What happened within these walls was not a conversation between pastor and parishioners. It was something much more personal, much darker." Sarah looked at Sarah Carter, her eyes watering. She didn't know if she was ready to see this, to accept that the man she had shared her life with had crossed a line she never imagined. But somehow, she knew, this was the truth that was being revealed little by little, in pieces, until there was nothing left. The detective, seeing the reactions of everyone in the room, paused, as if the words to follow were the final blow. He looked at Ethan, who was sitting at the other end of the table. His face pale, his hands restless on the table. "Ethan, do you have anything to say about this?" Miller asked, his voice cold and direct. Ethan, who had remained silent until then, slowly lifted his eyes. There was something hollow in his eyes, something that seemed to fade as the words formed. He took a deep breath before speaking, as if preparing himself to face something he could no longer avoid. I didn't want this to happen. I always wanted to help. I thought I was doing what was right, guiding them, guiding her. But I was wrong. I was terribly wrong." He lowered his head, and the words seemed to come out with difficulty, as if the very confession was torture. Sarah didn't know what to do. The man she knew, the man she loved, was now confessing to something so horrible it seemed impossible to absorb. But, at the same time, she knew the truth could not be ignored. The pain was right there, in front of her, and she couldn't run from it. Silence filled the room. Ethan's confession left everyone paralyzed, unsure of how to react. The words "I was wrong" seemed like an apology that could never be enough. How could he fix this? How could he repair what he had done? And, more importantly, what did he truly feel? Was it remorse, shame, or something darker, more selfish, that he was trying to hide even from himself? "You knew what you were doing was wrong, Ethan. You knew," Sarah Carter said, her voice cutting like glass. She was no longer willing to hear apologies, to accept explanations. She wanted justice, and for her, the word of a man who called himself a pastor was not enough. Ethan did not respond. He was broken, not just before the evidence, but before his own soul. What had he done? How could he have gone so astray? The final revelation came through a detail that no one had noticed before. During the investigation, Detective Miller found a document from a meeting that had never been recorded. A meeting that took place weeks before the scandal broke. The document indicated that Ethan had met with Grace and Anna for private discussions, where they were counseled on personal and spiritual matters. But this wasn't a typical confession meeting. It was something more. Something they called an adjustment, the kind of adjustment a pastor would make with a church member when he felt the need to correct something deeper. But what Ethan didn't know, and what no one had anticipated, was that one of those meetings had been recorded by a hidden camera, installed by a member of the congregation who had become suspicious of Ethan's actions. The footage that emerged from the recording was shocking. Ethan was there, with the girls, speaking softly, but with an authority that seemed manipulative, controlling. What appeared to be an attempt at spiritual guidance had turned into something terribly far from any kind of ethical leadership. The recording was the final blow, destroying any remaining doubt. The truth was exposed, leaving no room for denial. And what hurt Sarah the most wasn't just what Ethan had done to those girls, but the fact that she had never suspected, never even imagined that something like this could happen right before her eyes. And now, with everything revealed, what was left for Ethan and everyone involved? The recording Detective Miller found was a point of no return. The footage, now under close scrutiny, left no room for doubt. The man everyone had seen as the moral pillar of Maplewood, the one who preached about forgiveness, salvation, and faith, was now being unmasked as an immoral and selfish manipulator. He, who had been responsible for guiding the community, was now steering a dirty game where the lives of vulnerable people were pawns in a conspiracy whose origins and end he could not even pinpoint. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the recording. She replayed it in her mind over and over, as if trying to understand, trying to believe that what she was seeing wasn't real. But the truth was, she knew that this was confirmation of everything she had felt, everything she hadn't wanted to admit. There had been something wrong with Ethan, something from the beginning, something she had refused to see. As the investigation progressed, Sarah couldn't hide any longer. When she entered the church to speak with the detective, the tension was palpable, the dark atmosphere reflecting the inner chaos she felt. Ethan was in a corner of the room, shoulders slumped, a man destroyed by his own guilt or perhaps the need to salvage whatever was left of his image. The image of a leader, now broken, and the man before Sarah seemed like a stranger. She didn't want to believe the words of the detective. She didn't want to admit that the man she had married, the one who had sworn to be a faithful and devoted companion, could have done this with his own hands. But as each day passed, and more evidence came to light, it became clearer. And then, looking at Ethan in that room, Sarah didn't see remorse in his eyes. There was something else, something hidden beneath the layers of a confession that seemed forced. "Ethan," Sarah said, trying to control her voice, which betrayed her discomfort. "How could you do this? How could you look at those girls and see them as anything other than a soul to save?" Ethan looked at her, eyes lost, as if struggling internally with his own reason, but he didn't respond. The words seemed stuck in his throat, unable to come out. "I saw the recordings." "Ethan, I saw everything," Sarah continued, the words forming with a weight she never imagined she could bear. "You didn't just betray them, you destroyed the trust of an entire community. I'm trying to understand. I really am. But there's no going back now." The truth had spread, but there was still something else gnawing at them. The fact that no one seemed to understand Ethan's true motivations. It wasn't just about what he had done, but about why. Apparently, his vision of spiritual guidance had been so distorted that he no longer knew where his responsibility as a leader began and where his ego ended. He had used his position to control, manipulate, and exploit those seeking salvation. I don't know what happened," Ethan finally said, his voice faltering. "I just wanted to help. I thought that if I could give something more to them, I would save them. I would guide them to something greater." But what he said wasn't a justification. It was the confession of a man who had lost himself in his own ambition, confusing his power of influence with an authority that didn't belong to him. The manipulation was clear, but he didn't seem capable of perceiving the extent of what he had caused. His eyes were empty, as if he no longer knew where his morality ended, or where his own distortion of values began. "You didn't want to save anyone, Ethan. You wanted to control," Sarah said, more firmly. "And do you know what's most painful? That you made me believe it too. I was your accomplice in this game of shadows. I saw everything, but I didn't want to see." The room was silent. The echo of Sarah's words reverberated through the walls, hitting Ethan in a way he didn't know how to respond to. But it wasn't just him being confronted there. Sarah knew that her own pain, her own disappointment, was reflected in those around her. The weight of shame seemed to multiply. What he had done to those girls, what he had done to her and everything she believed in, was irreparable. Detective Miller observed the scene with a mix of frustration and resignation. He knew he already had the necessary evidence to arrest Ethan, but there was something more that he still couldn't understand, because, as clear as everything seemed, a part of him couldn't help but think that there was something more behind all of this, something more complex, more insidious, that involved more people. "I never wanted it to happen this way," Ethan whispered, but no one was listening anymore. There was no redemption possible for him at that moment. The weight of guilt was too great, the evidence too overwhelming, and the worst part was that he knew it. He knew there was no going back. The impact of what had happened spread throughout Maplewood. People were starting to question everything they had believed for so long. The cult of Ethan's figure, the blind worship many had felt for him, now seemed like a farce built on lies and manipulations. And yet, for those who still resisted accepting the reality, what was happening in those days seemed too distant to be true. But soon, everyone would have to face the facts, no matter how painful it was. As Sarah walked away from the room, her heart was a mess. She didn't know how to move forward. She didn't know how to look at the town, at her life, at her family, and find any way to move forward after everything she had discovered. But she knew there was one thing she could no longer ignore: the truth. though devastating, was the only thing that could finally free her from the lie she had been living. The storm that hit Maplewood was not just one of criticism or scandal. It was a silent revolution that tore apart the town's foundations, revealing cracks where harmony had once seemed to exist, as the once peaceful streets were now filled with murmurs, rumors, and confrontations. Sarah walked through the town as if still trying to absorb the weight of everything that had happened. The silence that followed her steps was uncomfortable. The people of Maplewood no longer looked at her the same way. She, Ethan's wife, was marked by history, as if her soul were being devoured by doubt and guilt. But the worst part was that the guilt she carried wasn't hers. She hadn't committed the crime, but in many eyes, she had been an accomplice, or at least part of a great deception. Ethan's arrest wasn't a relief, not for Sarah, nor for Anna and Grace's parents. Justice seemed late, but at the same time, the very idea of punishment seemed small in light of what was at stake. It wasn't just Ethan being judged, it was the entire community. The trust that had been destroyed in an instant, the hopes that had shattered into pieces. Sarah didn't know how, or if she even wanted, to return to the church. The place that had been her refuge, and that of so many others, was now hostile ground, a minefield of accusing stares. How could you not see, Sarah? She often asked herself as she looked at faces that had once been familiar. Her friends, now distant, wouldn't even greet her in the streets. The memory of the peace they once had in the small town seemed like a distant dream, lost in the shadows of Ethan's actions. But Sarah no longer blamed herself for not seeing things earlier. The manipulation had been subtle, just as the girls had been manipulated. She had been, by a man she loved, by a man she trusted. Ethan knew how to play on everyone's weaknesses, how to maneuver around their spiritual needs and use them to his advantage. And what if there was something more behind all of this? Something not just about abuse, but a greater strategy. Something he truly believed he was doing in the name of a higher good. The doubt still lingered in Sarah's mind, but she had no more answers. There was no more room for explanations. At the same time, the town, once proud of its unbreakable morality, found itself in a dilemma. Maplewood now needed to reconnect, to rebuild, but the scars were too deep to disappear in a simple act of forgiveness. And the worst part was that no one knew who to trust anymore. The lines between good and evil were blurred. The faith the community shared had been torn apart. Some people still defended Ethan, as if he were merely a victim of slander, but most stepped away, watching, judging. The simple fact that they had been deceived made them feel betrayed. The doubt spread like an invisible poison, eroding the foundation of faith that everyone seemed to share. Meanwhile, Anna and Grace's parents were struggling to find some form of justice. Their pain was palpable. Each day, the girls grew more withdrawn, more distant from everything and everyone, as if they were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. They knew that, even after Ethan's arrest, nothing could return the innocence that had been taken from them. The trauma was irreversible, but justice had to be done, not just to recognize what had happened to their daughters, but to ensure that no other children would go through the same experience. Sarah, on the other hand, was lost in her own feelings of helplessness. She felt like the town was looking at her with suspicion, as if she were part of the problem. Many said she didn't know, but who could really claim that? She had spent years living beside a man who was now considered a predator. How had this not been visible before? How had no one noticed the signs? She wondered if she would ever be able to look back and feel that her life made sense, or if now everything she touched would crumble like a sandcastle. At that moment, while walking through the streets of Maplewood, Sarah saw a child playing on the sidewalk. It was Charlotte, the daughter of an old family friend. Running joyfully, oblivious to everything that was happening, the child's innocence seemed a reminder of what the town had been before, and Sarah felt a deep pain upon realizing that this same innocence was now being torn from so many. Sarah made her way to Anna and Grace's parents' house. She needed to talk to them. even knowing that her words would be in vain. What could she say? They were right, she knew that. She needed to apologize, although she knew it wouldn't be enough. They were seeking revenge, and perhaps they were justified. She felt that everything she had done only helped Ethan carry out what he had done. When she arrived, the girl's parents were silent. There was a look of anger and pain in their eyes. Sarah didn't know how to begin, but the guilt manifested quickly. I didn't see what was happening," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear, I didn't know, but still, I feel like I failed." The silence between them was heavy. Grace's father finally spoke, his voice softer than Sarah expected, but full of contained despair. "You're not the only one who failed, Sarah. We all failed in some way, but that doesn't change what happened to our daughters. Nothing else matters now." Sarah felt the words like a knife. There was nothing more to say. The truth was now irreversible, and although Ethan's arrest was just the beginning of a long, difficult journey, Sarah knew that nothing could erase the pain she and her community would feel for the rest of their lives. Sarah didn't know how to react anymore. She was in a space between two worlds. The world she knew, that of Maplewood, where everyone was of faith, trustworthy, with good intentions, and the cruel, dark world she now faced, where appearances meant nothing, where trust had been betrayed, and forgiveness, if it existed, seemed almost impossible. She tried to understand what was happening around her, but she couldn't. Everything seemed like a blur, as if the town were crumbling under the weight of its own illusions. She didn't know if she was already grieving, but it felt like she was. Grieving for a town she had known and loved, but which had turned out to be a lie. Grieving for a marriage that deceived her. For an entire life built on a foundation of sand. Grieving for the girls, for their parents, for the lives lost and the lives that would still be lost. There was no more room for illusions. The reality was raw and naked, and she had to face it. But above all, what hurt the most was the fact that, even with all the evidence against Ethan, there were still people willing to defend him. Those who were so blinded by faith that they refused to see what was clear. Those who preferred to believe he was a victim of a conspiracy, that all of this was just a plot to destroy his image. And Sarah wondered, how can they ignore the girl's pain? How can they look at everything that's happened and still believe he's the good man everyone thought he was? She spent hours reviewing the recordings, the photos, the evidence that confirmed what she feared most. The man she had married wasn't the man she imagined. He wasn't the spiritual leader everyone thought he was. And yet, what he had done to those girls seemed to be becoming more and more complex. He hadn't seen them as spiritual daughters, as people who deserved protection. He saw them as an opportunity, a chance to control, manipulate, perhaps even use them to satisfy his own desires. And that hurt more than anything. The girls' parents were now immersed in a legal battle that seemed never-ending. The charges against Ethan were serious, but still, the town was divided. Some argued that he should be imprisoned immediately, that he should pay for what he had done. Others, however, campaigned for his acquittal, believing that he could never have committed such a heinous crime. The voices in Maplewood were growing louder and more aggressive. Sarah wanted to help. She wanted to do something that would bring peace to everyone, especially to the girls, but she knew she couldn't. She couldn't change what had happened. She couldn't return the stolen childhood of Grace and Anna. She could only watch, helpless, as the town's wounds continued to open, bleeding the truth. Meanwhile, Ethan remained in prison, seemingly unresponsive. The man who once seemed to have all the answers now appeared completely lost. There was no longer the confidence he once had in the words he preached. There was no longer that aura of leadership. The prison, which had once seemed like a simple solution to the problem, now seemed more like a reflection of his total downfall. But something else was happening, something Sarah still couldn't understand. There were rumors that, inside the prison, Ethan was being treated with a certain respect, as if, somehow, his position as pastor still carried weight, even among the criminals around him. And this made her wonder, what else had he done? How was he still able to manipulate situations, even now that he was confined? He shouldn't have any power now, Sarah thought, as she lost herself in her thoughts. He should be a broken man, a man without a voice. And yet, there are still people who believe in him. There are still people who see him as a leader. The town was at war with itself. People were divided into factions. Some afraid of the truth, others angry, and others in pain. No one knew what to do anymore. Not even Sarah did. But when she looked at the town, at the faces of the people she knew so well, she felt a strange sense of disconnection. There was no more trust between them, no more that unity Maplewood once had. And perhaps the most painful of all, Sarah felt that she no longer belonged in this place. That small town, once the stage of her life, now seemed like a maze with no way out. And what Sarah couldn't understand was how people kept clinging to a distorted image of Ethan, while the pain of their daughters and the weight of the loss of trust continued to crush them. Then, as if everything they had already faced wasn't enough, Sarah received an anonymous letter. The letter was folded simply, without a sender, and the paper had the texture of something old, used. The address was simply Maplewood, and the letter began directly, "You think you've seen it all, but Ethan's story is far from over. What you know is not the full truth, and there's something that hasn't been revealed yet. The town is far from being cleaned of all the filth." Sarah read the words again, feeling a chill run down her spine. What did that mean? She felt the weight of the letter in her hands, and for the first time, a new sensation overtook her. It wasn't just about Ethan. There was more. Something was happening in the shadows, something she still couldn't comprehend, something the town didn't want to see. Sarah held the letter in her hands as if it were a sacred object. The yellowed paper, the uneven writing, and the enigmatic tone seemed to be wrapped in a mystery greater than anything she had faced until that moment. But she couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed inside her. The idea that there was still more to be revealed had become an obsession that now consumed her. The town of Maplewood, which had long seemed unchanging and safe, was fragmented. The ruins of the scandal involving Ethan and his victims were everywhere, and the girl's pain, though silent, was palpable, filling the air with rising tension. The streets were emptier, the stores closed early, and the conversations, always in hushed tones, were now like shadows hanging over everyone. Sarah knew the town was on the brink of collapse. No one knew who to trust anymore. Ethan was imprisoned, but his influence still hung over the town like a dark cloud. The worst part was that, even with the evidence against him, part of the community still saw him as a martyr, a victim of external manipulation. They still saw him as the trusted pastor, the man of faith, and Sarah knew that wouldn't change anytime soon. And yet, something in the letter made her feel that the truth was still hidden, something no one had noticed, something beyond what was visible. Who had sent it? And why now, when everything seemed to be resolved? The letter seemed to challenge all expectations, and Sarah couldn't ignore the possibility that the greatest secret was still to come. She started to investigate. A sense of urgency overtook her body as she searched through the old files, Ethan's documents, the letters he had left behind. She was looking for clues, for something that could explain that mysterious letter, and then she found it. At the bottom of a drawer, hidden behind seemingly innocent papers, there was a notebook. Not just any notebook, but one that seemed to have been carefully organized by Ethan. Sarah turned the page with trembling hands. In small writing, there were notes, dates, and names, but one stood out, more recent than the others. It was a name, Grace Miller, the name of one of the families who had attacked her the most. Next to this name, there were more notes, conversations, messages, date, time, a secret meeting arranged. But what did this mean? At first, she felt disoriented. How was this related to what had happened? She looked at the other notes and saw that the connections were being made subtly. It was as if Ethan had been trying to organize something, or worse, manipulate the situations even further. The last page of the notebook revealed something that made Sarah stop completely. A date that could not be ignored. The day when Anna, another of the victims, was also mentioned. Not just mentioned, but involved in a meeting arranged with Ethan. How had she never known about this before? How had this never come to light? The questions kept growing. Anxiety took over Sarah. She could no longer see the line between truth and lies. Everything she believed, everything she knew, was being questioned by this revelation. Ethan hadn't just been a predator. He had orchestrated something much bigger, deeper than anyone could have imagined. He had manipulated not only the girls, but everything around him. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She reviewed every piece of the notebook, every date, and finally, she felt a chill. She remembered a conversation between Grace's parents and Anna's parents. Something she had never taken seriously. Something about a will, about an inheritance. And then, as if everything had fallen into place, she understood. The story wasn't about Ethan being the only guilty one. It was about how everyone was involved, directly or indirectly. The families, the friends, the town itself were blinded by loyalty, by faith, by trust, and above all, by guilt. Sarah didn't know how she would deal with this. She didn't know what to do with the truth now before her. She looked at the photos of Ethan, the images of the man she had loved, and felt as though she was looking at a stranger. The man she had known was no longer that, but he wasn't the one she now saw in prison, either. The man she had married was lost in a bigger game, in a web he had spun himself, and the result of this, the cost of this, was more than she could bear. When the trial finally came, everything seemed to have been decided before it even began. The evidence was too clear, the manipulation, the proof, the testimonies. But, in the middle of the courtroom, something extraordinary happened. Ethan's defense attorney, someone no one in the town expected, stood up. He was an old friend of Ethan, a former church member, and his words, though soft, were as sharp as knives. Ethan may have made mistakes, he said, looking directly at the judge, but the real issue here isn't his guilt. The issue is how much all of us, as a community, allowed this to happen. It's not just Ethan who is being judged. It's each one of us. The room fell silent. The words echoed for minutes before the judge made a decision. In the end, Ethan was convicted, but the town remained divided. While some felt relief, others, like the defense attorney, began questioning the true nature of the blame. Sarah, in turn, stepped away. The town would never be the same, and she knew she would never have a simple answer to what had happened. She wouldn't be able to erase the scars that were everywhere. The voices of the girls, her own, were now trapped in a story that could no longer be rewritten. But as she left the courthouse, Sarah looked at Maplewood one last time. She felt a sense of farewell. The town had changed, but so had she. The end of Ethan's story was not the end for her. It was the beginning of something new, something she didn't yet know what would be. But deep down, she knew that Maplewood would never be more than a memory of the past. The last thing she heard was the sound of a bell ringing in the distance. And for the first time, she felt that the weight of the truth had finally been set free.